Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite writers, and The Sandman is one of my favorite stories. But I wasn't introduced to Gaiman through The Sandman. I found The Sandman because I had read all of the Gaiman novels that my local bookstore carried and wanted more. But since this is the introduction to my Sandman Overture series videos, I guess the stories of how I found the original Sandman series and my experience reading them and my reaction to it is a good enough topic to start things off. I've always been a reader to some degree or another, and I've always enjoyed all different types of books, but mostly fiction, and usually the more macabre the better. My parents always encouraged my reading, and when I was in my early teens, yeah, they signed me up for a mail order book club. I wasn't familiar with many authors outside of Stephen King at the time, so I ordered two grab bags, which were just a random selection of about 5 books each. This might have been around the same time the Sandman was wrapping up its original run in comics, but comics weren't in my sphere of consciousness at the time, and definitely not Vertigo comics. I used to go to the comic book conventions they had in like Holiday Inn banquet halls, like little small ones, nothing like the big ones of today. And I'd pick up Hulk and Wolverine and Batman titles in the early '90s. But comics just weren't my thing. I only paid attention to them when they were right in front of me, and that wasn't very often. Anyway, getting back to the subject, two Neil Gaiman books came in those gram bags. The first one was Neverwhere, and I read that one right away. I think that was the first one I read. I don't remember why I jumped out. Excuse me. I don't remember why it jumped out at me now, but I dug the world that Gaiman built in it, and tore through that book pretty quick. It was a novelization of a TV series Gaiman wrote for like BBC TV, and I didn't know that at the time, and I still haven't seen the show. But it's been years since I've read Neverwhere now. um, maybe 20, maybe coming up on 20 years or something around there. And the details are fuzzy, but I filed it away in my bookshelf and randomly began to read other books from those grab bags between devouring every Stephen King novel I could get my grubby little hands on. I eventually got to the next Neil Gaiman book in the box, and that was Smoke and Mirrors. But this was years down the line because I took it with me when I got called up for jury duty for the first time. And since there's nothing to do but watch the PG-13 romantic comedy they put up for you, unless you're called for trial, and I wasn't called for trial, I spent the whole day reading Smoke and Mirrors and falling in love with the stories between its covers. The stories in Smoke and Mirrors are beautiful and tragic and comic and horrifying, but above all, they were unique. These stories were told with a confident voice by a man with something to say, even if that something wasn't stated outright. And while I wasn't left wanting more from any particular story in Smoke and Mirrors, because they each said exactly what they had to say in their own way, I was left wanting more from Neil Gaiman. Now, my memory is Swiss cheese, so I couldn't honestly tell you how long it was before I read American Gods, but it was the next Gaiman book I picked up, and it knocked my fucking socks off. I could go on at length about American Gods and how consumed I was by it and its world of gods and magic and fantasy. I could tell you how I went back and reread passages that struck me as profound or just beautifully written. I reread a lot of passages from that book. I could tell you that reading American Gods was a life-changing experience, and in its own way, it kind of was. But I'll just say that my appetite for Gaiman stories was insatiable after finishing it. I wanted to read everything he had ever written. So I set out on that journey, for a little while at least. The first stop was Good Omens, which I actually didn't like it all that much and placed the blame for that squarely on Terry Pratchett's shoulders. The story was good enough, and it had that Neil Gaiman flavor. The humor just turned me off a little. But I went on next to Stardust, and that quenched my thirst a little, but not enough. So then I found Coraline, which was, I think that's like a kid's book. But I couldn't find anything else in the store I was in when I was looking for his stuff, so I picked that one up, and that was a fun little book. But another book kept popping up in my searches when I would look up Neil Gaiman online, and that was The Sandman. But I never saw it on the store shelves with the rest of his works. But whenever I looked him up, that would be one of the things that came up. But sometime before Anansi Boys was published, and after reading Coraline, I found out that The Sandman was a comic book series. Since I didn't read comics at the time, I hadn't realized I didn't even know they sold collected editions of comics in bookstores. I didn't know about trades. So I figured I would go to this comic book store that was a couple of blocks from my grandmother's apartment. It was a store I'd been driving past in the back seat of my parents' car, and then in the driver's seat of my own car for years without ever going in. But I was aware of it. So Neil Gaiman got me into a comic book store for the first time in what had to have been at least 12 years, and since I had no idea where to begin to look, even though the store was small and cramped and I could have walked the perimeter in 30 seconds, I asked the clerk where Sandman was, and he took me the few steps to where it rested on the shelf. And there I was, face to face with the first comic I would read in over a decade. But if you'll excuse a brief aside, a fortuitous thing happened that day in the comic shop. A comic shop which would shortly become a weekly haunt for me. As I was trying to figure out how many volumes of The Sandman I should pick up. I only ended up buying one, because how good could a comic book be, right? Anyway, but on my way out, I couldn't help noticing the wall of new comics at the far side of the comic shop that wasn't really that far away at all. It was adorned with dozens of single issues facing out, just begging for my attention. Some of the characters were familiar, but most weren't. And on my way to the register, I stopped and picked up a couple of books just because. Now, fate would have it that 3 of those books just so happened to be the first 3 issues of Warren Ellis and Ben Temple Smith's Fell. I hadn't heard of either of those individuals before that day, but by nightfall, I was mildly obsessed with the both of them. Not to the extent that I was obsessing over Gaiman at the time, nor to the extent that I ever obsessed over Gaiman, but they are both 2 of my favorite creators to this day. And I have Neil Gaiman and chance, or maybe even destiny, to thank for that. I also picked up the first 2 issues of Ultimate Wolverine vs. Hulk that day because the covers were fucking awesome and I liked both characters. But I learned up front the joys and pains of reading comics, because that series wouldn't see another issue for more than a year, maybe 2, because the writer was too busy working on a piece of shit show called Lost. Not that Fell was unfamiliar with delays either. Hell, I'm still waiting for number 10 to come out. But we're getting away from the subject again. The first volume of Sandman, the first issue of Sandman proved to me that comics could be so much more than guys with big muscles and superpowers beating each other up or saving the world. The Sandman opened my eyes to a whole new medium in a whole new way. The Sandman shook my world and made me reevaluate things, and that doesn't happen often in a person's lifetime, I don't think. How could I have been so uninformed about comics? Why hadn't I heard of the Sandman before? How many other stories were there like this in the medium? I had so many questions when I finished Preludes and Nocturnes, and not just about this world I'd been introduced to, but this new magic that had been revealed to me. Because that's what the Sandman is, not the character, but the stories themselves. Neil Gaiman channeled something magical with the Sandman, in much the same way he channeled something magical in the short stories in Smoke and Mirrors, one of the most aptly named books I've ever read, and much the same way he channeled something magical in the long story that is American Gods. That magic, to some degree or another, runs through everything Gaiman has ever worked on. But he did this in Sandman for 7 years consistently, and he didn't do it alone. His magic spread to everyone that touched the series, from Dave McKean to Mike Dringenberg to Charles Vess and everyone in between. The Sandman is 75 issues long, and there isn't a bad issue. There isn't even a mediocre issue. It's all worth reading, and it's all been charmed by the magic that flows through Neil Gaiman. Rereading all of the introductions and afterwards in the old Sandman trades, I don't think I'm the first person to call Gaiman a magician. I'm not sure. I don't think I am. What he does isn't something that every writer can accomplish. You know how I know that? Because every comic isn't the Sandman. In fact, no other comic book is the Sandman. I guess you could say that about any book, but it would have a bit less impact if you said it about any other book, because any other book doesn't do what the Sandman does. It doesn't even attempt what the Sandman attempts. It doesn't tap what the Sandman taps. And many have said as much before me, and have said it more eloquently. Neil Gaiman's The Sandman is an accomplishment without compare. You can throw up your Watchmen and your Dark Knight Returns and whatever else have you. Hell, you could throw up the best works in any medium, and the Sandman would stand tall, because the Sandman is just that damn good. It somehow excels in, transcends, and at the same time elevates the comic book medium. But I don't know. Before I get away from myself, as if I haven't already, Preludes and Nocturnes introduces us to the Sandman. He is the ruler of Dream and one of the seven endless, beings older than gods and human consciousness. The first volume of his story follows his inadvertent capture, the 70 years of captivity that follow, his eventual escape, his retribution, and reclamation of 3 items taken from him upon his capture. And it's all wrapped up with a pep talk from his big sister, Death. I'm envious of anyone who picked this up at #1, and I wonder how long it took everyone to realize that this was more than just another comic. It couldn't have been very long. Even though I've heard both Gaiman and his editor call that first story arc awkward, and I guess it isn't as strong as the best issues of the series, but there's something very special going on in those first issues of Sandman. I certainly didn't want to stop reading the series after finishing, Preludes and Nocturnes. I started buying 2 trades a week until I was done, and cherished every moment of it. But reading that the first time was just an awesome experience, and just getting lost in that world and those worlds and those dreams was just unforgettable. That's just one of my favorite reading experiences of all time. But I just finished rereading the Sandman series in preparation for this week's release of the Sandman Overture, and I enjoyed it as much as, if not more than, my first time through. Since I was relatively new to comics the first time I read it, I didn't have anything to compare it to in comics. I just knew it was amazing. I didn't know exactly how much more amazing it was than pretty much every other comic story I would ever read, but I'm learning. I'm recording this at 11:10. It's 11:10 now. On the Wednesday that Sandman Overture #1 comes out. I think it's safe to say I'm more than a little bit excited. Maybe even a little bit nervous to read the first issue. I fully expect to enjoy it, and I hope it'll be a great addition to the Sandman mythos. And Eh, whew, I just can't wait. I don't know, but I'm I don't know. Oh, and if you wanted to know, I plan on making a video for each of the Sandman Overture comics as they come out. A more thorough look at the book than I usually do in my comics picks videos. So, man, I'm just looking forward to reading the Sandman Overture #1 in only a few short hours. The anticipation is killing me, and and I'm definitely gonna read this book as soon as I get home. I would in the car outside of the shop, but I think my daughter would get a little restless in the back seat. But that's it for now. I'll try to have my comic picks up tomorrow and the Sandman video up before the weekend is out. And I'll see you guys then. You guys, man, pick up Sandman Overture and man, let's talk about that stuff, baby. This is gonna be an awesome